Hey everyone, welcome to the Bookworm. I'm Dimitri, and today we're going to talk about my top 10 books of 2020. And by that I mean the top 10 books I read in 2020. So, getting started, my favorite book, my 10th favorite book this year, which I guess the numbering is arbitrary, but was the Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. This book has been on my to-read list for years, if not a decade at least. And I'm finally glad I just pulled it off the shelf and decided to read it this year. This book was incredibly inspiring and shocking, and I feel like I learned a lot. I was surprised by how much sexism and racism Malcolm X held, but I think part of that is for dramatic effect because you also see how much he changes at the end of the novel. And I think that's the most beautiful part about the book, is that it's really a showcase or an argument for the power to change and the power to grow in your beliefs. Malcolm X had some very radical views, and I think his viewpoints stayed radical but became more accepting as he, I think, matured and became more self-reflective. And yeah, just the ending of this book and seeing the transformation of Malcolm X was really amazing, and it's a shame that my high school experience did not focus on Malcolm X enough. Next on my list, and I took the book jacket off. Next on my list is The Best That We Can Do. The Best That We Can Do. I'm gonna butcher the author's name. Thi Bui. I'm so sorry. I should have looked that up. It's a graphic novel memoir, or an illustrated memoir, as it says on the cover. And it's about a Vietnamese family as they leave Vietnam during the Vietnam War and come to America. This was written by a local artist. She lives in Oakland, I believe, or she lives in the Bay Area. Anyway, she taught at the high school where I first started teaching. We were separated by, I think, a year or two. But that close connection I find kind of funny. Anyways, this came out in 2017 to pretty great reviews. I bought it without knowing that we had taught at the same school, and it kind of just heightened that experience to have that connection. But it's beautifully drawn. I plan on probably talking about this book a little bit more on my channel, as I'm going to be teaching it for the first time this year. I actually bought a classroom set for my students. I'm kind of experimenting with the idea of teaching graphic novels in high school literature classes. I already teach Mouse, and I wanted to use this as kind of a novel where we can compare and contrast the art, the image in Mouse to the images in The Best That We Can Do, and the storyline of how war and trauma can affect multiple generations. And Mouse by Art Spiegelman does that a lot. And really, Mouse is what opened the gates for books like this to come out. So more on that hopefully soon. My next book on the list, coming in at number 8, is Swans Way by Marcel Proust. This is part 1 of what people call the In Search of Lost Time novel. I guess the entire series is considered one novel. I just read part 1, but I liked it so much that I decided to do research and figure out what the best translations were for the entire series, so I bought that. I'm going to need a little bit of encouragement to finish the rest of the novel because it is incredibly lengthy, but the first book was excellent, and I've heard it stands alone pretty well. I do, I would like to read the entire series, but I need kind of advice and pushes on how to best tackle that. I would describe this novel as incredibly dreamlike, and it's probably so good at its job that you start to forget what you're reading because you get so lost in the dream. And that's kind of a good thing and kind of a bad thing. There are moments where I just kind of zoned out completely or lost track of which characters were who. But then there was also moments of the novel that were just incredibly beautiful, and shockingly beautiful, and made the entire ride worthwhile. So there's, not just paragraphs but pages. There's not really chapters, but portions of this novel that were just completely mind-blowing. And so I think taking it as a whole series will be worthwhile. What really struck my interest in this was probably one of my favorite contemporary series. It was the My Struggle series by Karl Ove Knausgaard, and a lot of people described him as Proustian. I do see some connections. I think the My Struggle series deals with class in a more interesting way. He's more of a proletariat kind of look at culture, where Swans Way is like looking at the bourgeoisie class from the inside. I know it's still supposed to be critical of the upper class, but I also just don't know. The focus is also of the upper class, and I don't really care too much. It's like too enmeshed into that class culture, and maybe my opinion will change on that. Number 7, which I don't have, so it'll be somewhere on either side of me, is the graphic novel Mr. Miracle by Tom King. Mr. Miracle is Tom King's reimagination of the titular character. He's reinventing a character by Jack Kirby, who's, I think, they call him the king of comics, but he's pretty much the grandfather of most of the superhero comics that you know, right? He invented most of them. Jack Kirby's most experimental work was the Fourth World series, when he left Marvel to work with DC, and he became a lot more free in what he could do. Mr. Miracle is probably his most boring adaptations, or most boring storylines in that kind of world. But Tom King does a really great reimagining of it. It's about this escape artist, and he can always escape death, and Tom King starts with Mr. Miracle trying to commit suicide, but he can't because he always escapes death. It's incredibly dark. It's a really good family drama as well, and it's a great psychological thriller. If I had to sum it up in one sentence, it was the most fun I had reading a superhero comic since Watchmen, and that's a pretty big statement on my end, because I loved Watchmen. Okay, number 6 on my list is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. I talked about this in my channel already. I just really love this book. It really stuck with me. The format is awesome. I've talked about that in my video. It talks about Maggie Nelson. She calls this auto theory. It's like autobiography and critical theory at the same time. She talks about being stuck in between two worlds, the heteronormative world that we all are stuck in, but also the homonormative world, because she's in a queer relationship, and there are still standards that she feels obliged to stick to within that culture. And so she tries to break down both of those, and looks at semiotics and symbols to kind of understand both of those cultures. This gave me a really great insight into trans issues and feminist issues. But really, at its heart, is this book is just a really great conversation. It's a really, really fun conversation. It feels like you're talking to someone throughout it. So I highly recommend The Argonauts. Next on my list was probably the most fun novel I read. It's number 4 on my list, so it wasn't my favorite novel, but it was the most fun, which is White Teeth by Zadie Smith. A lot has been said about this book, so I don't think I can add anything too great to it. I have a video on it as well. It feels like the 21st century a little bit. It feels like a British version of Middlesex, the novel by Eugenides that won the Pulitzer Prize a while ago. It's a family drama told through 3 generations, and it's really funny. And she just, every moment punches. This is great. Number 4 on my list is Let Us Praise Famous Men by James Agee and Walker Evans. So James Agee is a novelist. He wrote Death in the Family. He's an American novelist, and Walker Evans is a photographer. I feel like I should talk more about this book. I don't even know how to sum it up, right? It's really all over the place. I'm studying graphic novels right now because I'm going to teach that to my students soon. And so what I found really interesting is, the decision to publish this with photographs as because it makes the case that the word and images are working together, and the images change, your experience with the images change as you read, and also they're just great photos. And so that was really interesting for me. I found this work, it follows three families in 1936 in a very impoverished area of Alabama. So it's a reflection on poverty and American culture, and journalism and art and high art and low art. It's really just this massive sprawling text. My mother's partner is a English professor, and he says this is the Ulysses of nonfiction. It's a nonfiction text, but it reads just like Ulysses by James Joyce would read, in maybe a more accessible way, but still just as sprawling and imaginative. It's a very radical book. I read parts of it out loud just because the sound of the prose just was so musical, more so than anything I think I've ever read before. It just sounded very musical. It wanders all over the place, but it just sounds amazing. It's easy to get lost, kind of like In Search of Lost Time by Proust was, but there are those nuggets that just make life worth living more. This book made me think more about poverty, about what it means to be American. Its chapter on education was just amazing, to have so much insight on the education system and how it oppresses people, or how it can oppress people. It's just very ahead of its time. This book is worth a while. Everyone should read that. Okay. Next on my list is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paolo Friere. This is, I think he's Portuguese. This book has probably influenced my teaching philosophy more so than any other book. The only other competitor would be Neil Postman's Teaching as a Subversive Activity. This is a communist text, and it talks about how the education system can be used to oppress people. So there are ties between Agee's work and this, the last book I was talking about. It talks about the system of education, of just one person telling a classroom information, is a system that is set up by the oppressor. But it's called the banking model. And so if I'm just lecturing at someone, there is this power dynamic that is maybe morally incorrect. But it advocates for teaching through the inquiry method, maybe more of a Socratic seminar kind of method, where you're asking questions and you're working with the class and having them kind of be the students be co-teachers in the experience. And I'm not fully against the banking model, but I think trying to use the inquiry method over the banking model is something that I highly advocate for. And this is also just some great revolutionary thought, and it deserves reading and rereading and rereading. Number 2 on the list is a weird one for me. It is a nonfiction text. I guess the last 2 are technically nonfiction. This is probably an overhyped book, and maybe my love for it will deteriorate over time, but I just had such a fun time reading it. It's incredible. It's surprisingly accessible, and I was also surprised by how funny and hilarious this book is. It's a Buddhist take on evolution, the evolution of the human species, of our species, and it really, lets us see the forest from the trees. It gives us a big lens to view our entire history of our species and truly understand how little we matter. And it gives you as close to historical proof as you can get for why you should maybe be Buddhist, or why you should have a viewpoint that your life doesn't matter. It's that lens of looking at through this kind of, I don't want to say Darwinist, but this Buddhist and evolutionary take on humanity is just so beautifully done, so much fun to read, and incredibly engaging throughout. So Sapiens was a ton of fun for me. And before I get to number 1, let's do some honorable mentions. In no particular order, we got ourselves 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger. You know, I read Catcher in the Rye in high school, but I've come to love Salinger's other works maybe more than Catcher in the Rye. I read the graphic novel series, all 3 books of March, which covers the life of John Lewis, who passed away this year. I'm glad I read this before John Lewis passed away. I knew nothing about him, and I learned so much about him and about the civil rights movement. This is a book that is starting to get taught in high school now, and I highly recommend it in U.S. history. I think this book needs to be taught. It's beautifully drawn, but also just a really great kind of overview and instructional guide of how to make good change. Highly recommend that. I reread Persepolis and really loved it. So there's that. And I read this collection of essays by Emily Nussbaum. She writes for The New Yorker, called I Like to Watch, and it's about TV culture and TV analysis and treating TV as literature, but we shouldn't call it literature, we should call it television. It deserves to be its own art category and held as high art. So there's some really great polemical kind of writings in here. Confessions of a Human Shield, her take on the Me Too movement and what to do with hideous men in the industry. That's phenomenal, but her the big picture essay about treating television as art that deserves to be treated as art is also amazing. And then probably last, but still deserves an honorable mention because it just stuck with me, is The Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, and I talked about this book in my last video. Okay, so there's that. Coming in at number 1 on my list is the book that made me start a BookTube channel. It's my most popular video to date right now. It's Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. This is maybe the most difficult book I've read, or at least it felt like the most unfair book I've ever read. It really asks a lot of the audience. After I read it, the jury was still out whether I loved it or hated it. It definitely haunted me this year. It worked in making me feel very paranoid, and it just primed me for COVID, right? For all the paranoia and hysteria and fear and everything that was about to come. I kind of analyze what I think the book's really trying to get at. I talk about the sin of analysis, that to name something and to put words around it is capturing it, but it's also killing it. And that was a really interesting question to grapple with. Civility versus anarchy are things that are grappled with really well in here. But ultimately, it's a book about the ugliness of humans and how terrible we can be to each other. And for that sake, it's pretty dark and depressing. But I guess I loved it. It really influenced the rest of my reading and the way I thought for the rest of the year. And so that's why it earned its spot as number 1. So that's my top 10 books with, I think, 5 or 6 honorable mentions. I hope you guys enjoyed the videos. Based off of my reading, I would love more recommendations. I'm kind of stuck on what I want to read next right now, and I would appreciate any feedback that you guys have. Thanks for watching. Like it if you liked it. Subscribe to it if you want. All right.